So everything we have created so far is inside of this null object, which I have called section large, as opposed to the smaller section that we started off with. So let's continue and make this scene even larger. I'm gonna look through our camera once again, which we just want to double check it's in the correct relative position to our character, which is the X position is -525, the Y position is 75, and the Z position is -500, and it's pitched up by 10 degrees at a focal length of 24 millimeters. So that's quite a wide angle. We will come back to this shortly. For now, let's take this whole section and place this inside of an instance. So, if I have the object selected there and go get an instance, it will automatically link it, because now I can move this instance ahead and join it up to the first section. So the Z position of this is going to be 7500. And if you have used the same numbers which I have up to this point, everything should just line up perfectly. Let's do this a couple of times more. So this is the first copy. I will hold Control and drag down to make another copy of this instance. And by the way, if for whatever reason your instance is not linked the first time, you can drag the reference object manually to this section in the instance. Anyway, the next position for this third instance, the position is going to be 15,000. So we are moving this in increments of 7,500 centimeters. So we now have 3 lined up like this. We also need one behind our character at the start. So I will make another copy, and let's position this one at a -7,500, and that will line up edge to edge in the opposite direction, which is behind the character. Okay, if we now just scrub through the animation or just hit play, let's go to grow trading with lines so we can see where these cut off. Right now, the initial animation we created for the character was just for that smaller 2,500 centimeter section. Now the section is much larger. It's 3 times as long. So we need the character to keep going through 3 of these, or rather through one large section. So what I am going to do is go back to my timeline. We're going to continue the repetitions, and also the timeline just needs to be extended to be 3 times longer. So 19 times 3 is 57. So let's change that to be as such, and then 3 frames times 3 is 9. So the new length is 5709, but that could be different depending on whatever scales and values you are working with to begin with. Okay, so with this extended timeline, let's click on the repetitions on our character, which I will change to be 3 times more. So 17 times 3, we can just type in that formula and we get 51. Let's do 52 just to be safe. And if I look out of the camera, we can see the character does keep walking, stops here suddenly. And that's because actually the Z position was manual in the end. So we can just change this keyframe value to 7,500 in the key properties over here, just that one keyframe. And we can also change where the keyframe is in time. So this should be 5709, just like the length of our animation. Now it runs through the entire length of the whole thing. If I scrub through, we can see the character now walking throughout the whole section. So this much longer scene and longer timeline if you want to create a fully looping scene, this is what you would have to do as well. And this is nearly a minute long, which is quite a lot of frames in the end that we will be rendering. But that's the setup required for the full loop. You could maybe just, so if you wanted a shorter animation, for example, you could still just end the animation at like 20 seconds instead. It's entirely up to you. Anyway, I digress here. Let's continue. I will look through our camera and let's re-enable the instances. I am going to create a separate null object which will carry the camera. So this will be camera carry. And let's put that in there. This will be moving at the same rate as the character. So at frame 0, let's set a keyframe for the Z position to be 0. And at the end, it will be 7500. And then keyframe that to hold Control and click this circle. And in our timeline window, we can open up that new keyframe. And with it selected, I will click linear to make sure we have a constant speed for our animation. Now we can play through the whole thing and see what we have. Remarkably, this is still very responsive despite having quite a lot of objects, you know, in this quite large scene. But that's the great power of using instances in Cinema 4D, particularly with the cloner as well. When we get to the end here, we can see a jump, which is quite obvious. So obviously we need to do more setup, but generally we are on the right path. So this just means we need more clones or instances going in that direction so we can hide that jump. So we will continue copying these. Let's have this one, another 7500 centimeters downstream, which is going to be 22,500. And again, this time we'll go to 30,000. And I think a couple more times should be enough. So this is the 5th instance. The 6th one would be at 37,500. I will just do the formula for this, plus 7,500, and we get 45,000 centimeters. Okay, so now let's look at what that jump looks like. If I skip to the end here, it is still visible, but because it's further away, it's not as noticeable. But of course that won't do here. So whilst that's not as bad, it's still not really good enough. You know, we spent a lot of time to be as precise as we can. We want to continue and clean that up too. I will cover that separately in a lesson, but for now I think we are looking pretty good. One final detail another object I will create in the scene is out there in the distance, which is going to be a mountain. So this will just be another massive landscape object. This time, let's go to the size and set this to 75,000 as the base size. I will move this far out into the distance. You can see as I zoom out here, things will start to disappear out of view. It's to do with the draw distance in Cinema 4D. So to help with this, if I press CTRL and D, for the view clipping in the project settings, let's change this from medium to large. And now that point at which things disappear will be further out. You will rarely ever have to go past large. Let's move this massive landscape out there in the distance. I will place it at 100,000 centimeters. So that's 1 followed by 5 zeros. And at frame 0, make this a child of the same null object which carries the camera, so that it moves at the same rate, which means relative to the camera, it will appear as if it's not moving as we go through the scene. So that's one step. I will also go to the C level of this, and let's set this to, let's say, 25, which, by the way, this controls the flatness, the general flatness of all the features on the landscape. So 25 is fine. We can apply the same dirt material to this too, although this detail is going to be so far in the distance, it's not really going to be all that visible, but let's just go with it anyway. And one more change I might do here is just rotate this until I get an angle which I like. Just trying to view this from the perspective of behind the character. About here, so negative 150. I think I prefer this view. And this also helps with this disappearing hills at the side. Because before there was nothing behind there, with the mountains behind there, it helps to obscure that just a bit. But anyway, we will get rid of that in the lesson that follows. At this point, if you do run into some performance issues, what's great is you can simply just hide these instances in the preview by changing this dot at the top. The top one is for, the preview, and then the bottom one is for the actual render. So if it's disabled in the preview, that helps with the general performance when we hit playback. And when we render, it is still present in the actual picture. So you get the best of both worlds. It's exactly the same thing that we did earlier with the plants when we were creating the detail on the side of the road. So if I re-enable these plants, so re-enable the cloner, and also unhide it, and try to play this back with all the instances turned on, for example, you can see basically we grind to a complete halt. But, we don't have to do that. We can continue working quite fine at this level of visibility. So just keep that in mind. You can speed up your scene, and you don't have to be pulling your hair out as you're trying to do some smooth playback. So far our loop is almost seamless, but definitely not 100%. So in this lesson we're going to go over a technique for creating pixel perfect loop transitions. To get rid of this visible cut or glitch at the end of our loop, if you look closely right there, we are going to create an extra instance to put out there in the distance, and then we will also reveal the mountains at the same speed that the camera is moving, and that will completely get rid of any visible jumps in the animation. So let's see how that works in practice. Let's start by extending this once again, so get another instance. This one will be at 52,500. It ends up almost touching this other larger mountain in the distance, so really far out here. The object that's most visible in the cut is the tall mountains, but just to be sure everything is going to be seamless, we will apply this effect to everything. So if I select all the 3 sets of mountains, and later we'll also include the poles in this, but just the mountains to start with. In the Effectors section, let's go and add a plane effector. So under Mograph, Effector, and Plane. And the plane effector affects everything equally, which is why everything just jumped up slightly just now, because by default it moves everything by 100 centimeters. We want to do the opposite, and with a much higher number, so a negative 1000. This is going to move things underneath the floor plane. So what we want to do now is to restrict where this takes place to be out here somewhere. Let's go to the Fall Off tab, and I'm going to add a linear field, and this is with the plane effector selected. So if I do that, and let's change the direction from X plus to Z plus. if we go over here, this is where it came in at the start of our scene. I can move this towards the end of the scene, and hopefully you can start to see what's happening. This is now revealing the mountains as I move it through the scene like this. However, right now it's too abrupt. We need to smooth out the transition, and that's done by increasing the length of this field. The best setting for this is half whatever the length of these sections are, which is 7500. So it will be 7500 divided by 2, which is 3750, and this extends the same distance from the center, so it ends up covering an entire section. But more importantly, as I move this now, you see the transition is more gradual. So what I would do is, at the very end of the animation, that's going to be our reference starting point, I will move this to almost the very end before it falls off the edge here. But the whole thing needs to be behind that point. And I've just realized I have been moving just the linear field itself, which is fine, but the actual plane effector is still over here. So what I will do is I will zero out the position of the linear field so that it also goes back to the beginning of the scene. Now I think if I just try to grab this handle, it will still move just the linear field by itself. So what I'm going to do is go to the plane effector's coordinates and change those. I think it was about 55,000 or so to be in the correct place. So everything has been moved to the end over here, and we can see this purple or pink range. That's the length of our fall off. So that's close enough right there. And that's just a preference. You can just move the linear field by itself if you want to. Anyway, at the end of the animation, let's make this a child of the same camera null, which is moving our camera, so that now this will move at the same rate as the camera. And the overall effect of this is that now when we play through the animation, that effector is slowly revealing the mountains, and it's so smooth and so slow, it's not perceptible. And the final result is that when we get to the end of the animation, you will no longer see any glitching in the distance. The only stop we are seeing right now is just when Cinema 4D jumps back to the beginning and it has to think about what's in the scene before it starts playing back again. But if this was the actual final rendered animation, this would be solidly perfect. So that's it. I said I would do the same for the poles. It's actually not necessary in this case because they are small enough and converge in the center of the frame. You don't see any jumps, but just in case this was the problem also, we can include the poles in that reveal effect. Now the poles are not in any cloner, so we need to put them inside one because effectors will only work on Mograph objects such as the cloner. So at the very beginning, let's solo the pole by itself, and I will just hold the Alt key and insert a cloner like this. Now we just need a count of 1, and because I held the Alt key when I inserted this, it will inherit the same position. So when I unsolo this, everything will still look exactly the same. It's just now that the object which holds the telephone pole is a cloner rather than just a piece of geometry. So now what I can do is include this same effector into this cloner for the poles. And if I go over to the end of the animation, we can see now that these are now part of this reveal effect, which just may help with any glitches which occur. We can see that it's moving as a single unit, the 3 of them at once. That's because of this cloner for the smaller section with render instances enabled. It treats this as one object, which is faster for responsiveness, but may not be useful in this case. So if I change it to instance, it will now start treating these as if they were individual objects. And that's exactly what we get. So just another adjustment we may have to make, or not at all, depending on what the scene looks like. But it's good to have the option and knowing what to do if you need to do it. But now I can see my scene is much slower and less responsive. So these kinds of changes may be worthwhile to do at the end of the project, so that in the meantime we can continue to have a faster response. But anyway, now you know. So I will listen to my own advice here and switch this back to render instance for now, and just switch it back before the final render. We will now develop the look and style of our scene. It's a nighttime lighting style, and at the end we'll also add some fog and atmosphere effects. There are two primary lights in our scene. The first light illuminates everything generally so that nothing is completely dark and featureless, so we just end up seeing some of the details on the road and just some of the color on the telephone poles and the hills and so on, and even just some subtle shading on the character. Obviously this is still meant to be quite a dramatic lighting style, mainly based around silhouetting the features in the scene, but you still need that base level of illumination. So that's the first light. It's a general ambient light. The second light is coming from over there somewhere, and you can see the long shadows behind the character, for example. And another feature of this light is that on the hills, in some areas you see some subtle directional highlights hitting from over there somewhere, and it makes sense for this scene because that's where our light source is coming from. Let's jump into Cinema 4D and see if we can replicate this. I had already started this, so let me reset. Let's get a new light, and we are just going to go to the color. This is going to be a blue tone, about 210 degrees, with some saturation. It's a nighttime scene, so I'm going for a cool color here, so blue. For the V, which is the brightness, we can maybe lower this to about 60. And saturation I will actually drop further down to about 20-25 or so. Okay, and you can already see a quick preview of what this is doing. At frame 0, however, the light is somewhere over here in the center of the scene. And if I quickly preview, we just get this very odd looking scene. So in the light, there is a setting called ambient illumination. Let me turn this on. And what this does is it illuminates everything in the scene equally. So you end up with a very flat looking image. So it's working, it's just too strong. Let's go to the intensity of this light and drop it to about 20-25 as well. Let's go with 20. And another quick preview, we can see that it's a lot less powerful. So that's our first ambient general light. And with this switch turned on, it doesn't matter where the light is in the scene, it will affect everything equally and look the same regardless. So we can call this our ambient light. Let's now get an infinite light, and this is going to be our directional light, which will be coming from over there somewhere. Let me jump out of the camera so we can see an overview of the whole scene. If I select this light, we can see right now the direction of the light is dictated by this line we see here. So currently the light is going that way. We need to rotate it 180 degrees. And you can see the preview in the viewport anyway. As I rotate this, you can see the direction of the light changing. So at 180 degrees for the heading, the light is now pointing this way. And then we also just need to angle it down. I will set this to about 10 degrees, so negative 10 degrees. And then if we look through the camera, let's just give it a moment. So a quick preview to see how this is working. We can now see there is some direction to our illumination, and we can see some highlights on the telephone poles and, you know, on the hills and so on. We need some shadows though, so let's go to light and go to the shadow section, and I will enable ray traced hard shadows. Also, the light is too strong, so I will drop the intensity to 25. And let's do another quick preview to see what we are working with. Instead of jumping to preview up here all the time, maybe I can use the interactive renderer. If I hold Alt and R, it opens up this render region, which I can just stretch out to frame my whole scene. And let's put this quality slider to the top. Just wait a few moments for it to process. And there we go. So now we have a constant render to be looking at. It's a very subtle lighting style, so it might not look all that impressive just yet. But another thing we need to add here is the atmospheric effect. That's this blue fog we see throughout the scene. This is found under the physical sky. So if I hold left click over the floor icon and get the physical sky, we can see what this does. So we don't need any sunlight from this. This is in the basic tab. Let's just go ahead and turn that off. And we also don't need any of the sky elements either. So if I just wait for this to show what it looks like right now, you could perhaps try, you know, some different lighting style if you want. You know, this is like a daytime kind of thing. But I'm sticking with the darker night scene. Let's turn off the sky, and in the time and location, I will set this to 2400 hours so that it's at midnight, which is going to give us a dark scene. At this point, I could even enable the sky once again, and because it's at nighttime now, we changed the time to midnight. We would get some stars instead of like blue skies. But the way we are setting up our project, we are actually going to output this without a sky at all. And all of this you see was done in After Effects. The advantage being that we can change this to anything we want after we have outputted the render from Cinema 4D. Anyway, we'll get to that eventually, but for now let's get back to creating our fog. So if I go to the Basic tab, we want to enable fog down here. Let's disable the sky once more. And I think my plants may be delaying my render too much. So let's go to the grass and actually turn it off completely. That's this cloner here. I'm going to switch it off and hide it also. This should just speed up the processing time for the render. Okay, so the fog by default is going to look like this. We have to change quite a few things, such as the density. Let's lower this to 5%. And that is much quicker previewing now, so that's great. And the color, we can go for anything, but I'm keeping that same color scheme that I have been using so far. So about 210 for the hue, which gives me this blue color. Saturation I will set to 75 and the brightness to 50. And let's see what that gives us. I want the fog to be taller and more prominent, so I will go to the end height and set this to 4000 centimeters. You can see it's much stronger now. And the start height I will drop down to, let's say, negative 2500. So this whole fog effect is going to start further below the ground. It just lowers it so that some of these details closer to the camera can be affected by the fog as well. This can be pushed even further if we were to drop this to, let's say, negative 4000. So just a flip of our current height. You can see each time the fog appears to be a bit closer to the camera. This might be too strong still, so let's maybe lower this density anywhere between, I would say, 2.5 and 5. Like this, let's go for 3.5 perhaps. It's a very sensitive value, so even some small changes will make a big difference. And of course, this is the fog effect in Cinema 4D, which means that you are going to run into the fog glitch, which happens every time you use the fog effect in Cinema 4D. Let me show you what this glitch or bug is, and then I'll show you how to fix it. If I were to just output this current frame to the picture viewer, so in render settings, let's disable save. We just want to output to the picture viewer for preview purposes. And let's go for a 200% zoom level, just so we can see a bit better. So this is what the scene currently looks like. If I were to close down this project, so let's just close all projects which are open, we can save it and then reopen it. So under recent files, it's this one at the top. Without changing anything, I am just going to start by rendering to the picture viewer once again. And after a few seconds, we can see that the fog is not rendering correctly, especially close to the camera. If we compare this to the actual correct render, what it should look like, it's this, and then this is the broken glitch. So this is going to happen anytime you use the fog effect in Cinema 4D and you close down a project and reopen it again. Or perhaps you send this to the render queue, or maybe even send it to someone else. You know, if you work in a team, for example, if somebody reopens your project that uses the fog effect, they are going to run into this issue. It happens because in the physical sky, the fog effect does not reinitialize itself correctly after being closed down. So what's happening is basically the fog is failing to reinitialize and reloading correctly. But look what happens if I just change any one of these values slightly. You will see that it will now look correct. So that's the fix. We have to force Cinema 4D to do this each time the project reopens. And the easiest way is to just animate one of these values between frame 0 and 1. So at frame 0, I will set my start height to, let's say, negative 3999. Set a keyframe, move forward one frame, and then change this back to what it should be, which is negative 4000. This will work with any of these if you just change them slightly between frame 0 and 1. And those two keyframes will force Cinema 4D to render any frames after that correctly. So the first frame may still be lost because of this, but luckily for us, and let me just disable the interactive render for a moment, the first frame is actually identical to the last frame of our animation. And if I jump back and forth, you can see this is really the case. So it means that those two frames actually will always be doubling up anyway when we play this back as a loop and repeating it. So we were always going to take out one of these frames regardless. And since the first frame may render incorrectly, that's the one we will always cut from the final animation. So that's the fog glitch in Cinema 4D, and it will happen to your project too, but now you know how to fix it. It's been around for several versions of Cinema 4D. Basically, since this was a feature, it's just part of the software. And I have talked to the people who developed the software, and they told me basically, yeah, there is no fix for this currently, except if you do this trick. But of course, this is something you'll have to repeat each time you use this. Otherwise, you might have some issues. Anyway, that's it. Let's move on. That's it for the lighting in Cinema 4D. It's a very subtle and understated look, but later on when we add the skies and backgrounds, it's going to look even more interesting. Let's now look at how we export our animation from Cinema 4D. We want to optimize our render settings for both speed and quality. We have now finished everything we need to build in Cinema 4D, which means we just have to output our frames so that we can do the compositing in After Effects. So, I mean, clearly there is a huge difference between what we have right now, just what I would refer to as the base scene. And then later in After Effects, we'll be able to turn that into what you see here. And of course, this is just one of the examples. In order to have this amount of control later in After Effects, we need to output more than just our base image in Cinema 4D. So let's see how that works. In addition to the standard image or the normal render, we are going to output some different passes, and that's what's going to give us that control we need in After Effects. Before we set up the final render, let's just go to the render settings, and I want to look at this anti-aliasing section. Let me just output one more frame to the picture viewer, and I will use this for comparison purposes. This frame is too small though. Let's go and change the output to 1920 by 1080 just for now, and then let's do that quick test. So that frame for me takes about 18 seconds. This is on my fairly old computer. I've had this since 2013, so it's pushing nearly 8 years at this point. But that's because in the anti-aliasing settings here, I haven't really pushed these up, but it really might not be necessary to do so in this particular scene. But anyway, let's go to anti-aliasing. This just controls how smooth the image is. If I change it to best, and let's go for a minimum level of 1:1 and a max level of 2:2, so it's not too high. The higher these are, the smoother the image will be, but also it will take longer. And past a certain point, you will hit diminishing returns, which means, you know, you experience much longer render times for a not so great increase in quality. Anyway, let's try these settings 1:1. 2:2 with a threshold of 5%. For the threshold, the lower this is, the cleaner the image will look. But once again, you don't want to push this too far, otherwise it would just be too slow to render. Anyway, let's try this and do a comparison in both the render time and the difference in quality or cleanness. And the difference here really isn't all that great, both in terms of the quality I am getting and the render time. So this has gone from 18 seconds per frame to 20. Not a big difference at all. So this is why I said earlier we might not need to really bump up the quality because the difference is negligible. And you know, the type of scene we are dealing with here, it's very dark. Not a great amount of detail to look at anyway. It's really more about the form and silhouettes and art style. If this were different, perhaps a brighter scene with you know, things like more shadows and more reflections, then making those changes here would be more apparent as to what's going on. So we are just going to leave this section as geometry, which is going to give us a pretty fast render and also an image which looks pretty good as well. Okay, so I made a mistake here. The anti-aliasing should be set to 1:1 and 2:2 and 5% for the threshold. I noticed after my render finished that parts of the floor were flickering, which was caused by leaving this on the geometry setting. So you definitely want to go to at least the best settings and 1:1, 2:2 with a threshold of 5%. If you want to find out more about what all of this stuff does and you know, in more detail, you can right click and show help and read up their documentation, which has some diagrams to really illustrate what's happening, and this is very useful for that. Let's look at the other settings, starting with the output section. We have our frame width and height, so that's 1920 by 1080, just a regular HD. Further down we have the frame rate, which I will set to 24 to match our project settings, and the frame range is going to be all the frames. By default we were just outputting whatever frame we were looking over in their timeline. So anyway, this should be all frames, and I can see that in total I am going to have 1778 frames, which is quite a lot. So that's why this section about keeping the render time as low as possible is important, because we have a lot of frames to deal with. This whole animation is nearly a minute long. Next up is the Save tab. This is where we specify the save location and the file format. So let's do that. You can see I already set a path for this already. I have created a new folder for the main sequence, which will be in this folder called main number 2, and save. And the format is going to be PNG and 16-bit, which is enough to hold a lot of information without also being too large. I find that 32-bit is overkill in like 99.9% of the cases. So 16-bit is more than enough and will contain enough information for making changes in After Effects. So those are the basic render settings in Cinema 4D, and we're going to take this further in the following lesson. In this lesson, we will go over how to export our images as layers using the multipass system in Cinema 4D, so that when we get to the After Effects section, we can have more control over what our images look like. So if we were doing nothing else to this animation, this would be ready to render in this format. But we are going to do a lot of work in After Effects, which will be aided by outputting some multipass layers. So this starts with enabling this multipass switch, which over here will now reveal a second save path for the multipass layers. So let's go ahead and specify a path for that. I will create a new folder, which I will call multi. In here, let's save the file name as multi. And the format is also going to be 16-bit PNG. The multipass layers we want here are as follows. If I click the multipass button, for some reason post effects is already here, but we don't need it. So I will just click it and delete. And then I will add the ones which I might need later in After Effects. The ambient pass, for example, this would contain any parts of the image where we used luminant materials, but since we don't have any, we can just ignore this. We do have diffuse. This is the regular base color part of the image, so let's bring that in. Specular are the highlights from the materials and the lights. We need that. Shadow is self-explanatory. I don't think there were any reflections in the scene, so we will ignore this one too, but maybe it's a good idea to just bring it anyway, just in case. It's good to have it and not need it, than vice versa. So these 4 layers in this case would be what makes up my current final image. I will add an atmosphere layer. This is going to contain any atmosphere effects, in this case our fog layer. And just to quickly illustrate how this works, if I do a quick render once again, if I render this out, we can see that the first frame renders incorrectly, which is that fog glitch. So this is perfectly expected and normal. But from the second frame after that, you see it renders exactly as we would expect. I can press escape to cancel the render, and let's go to the layer section in our picture viewer, and I will take single pass. And now you can see if I click on these different layers that we just set up in the multipass, each layer only contains one part of what makes up the final image. I can tell that the specular layer is very subtle. There's just a small highlight on the telephone pole there. We have the shadows, of course, which are quite obvious. There's no reflections at all, so we can definitely get rid of this one, and the fog is quite prominent. So that's what's happening there. Cinema 4D renders all of these layers anyway when you output just a normal image. So that's why we can separate it into layers like this without adding any extra render time. I forgot the diffuse channel there. We can take out reflection. So in addition to these layers, we are also going to output the black and white masks, which I talked about earlier. We need a mask for each of these objects. And in Cinema 4D, these are called object buffers. So if I start with the character, for example, let's right click and go to Render Tags and Compositing. And there is a Object Buffer tab here. Let's go to that and enable Object Buffer number 1, which is the first one right there. We can attach a different buffer to, let's say, the telephone poles. So that's in here somewhere, and my grass is still turned off. Let's bring that back. Let's see. So the telephone poles, that's this object. And just to confirm, I can turn this on and off and see if it disappears. And it does. Let's right click, Render Tags and Compositing. And this time we're enabling render buffer number 2. Now we can do this by just enabling the second switch, or you could also still enable the first one, but just type out number 2 in here instead. Whichever method seems easier to remember. Personally, I like to actually use the 12 switches we have by default here. But if you have more than 12 buffers, you would have to start just changing the numbers instead. So now we are going to have a mask for the character and the telephone poles. We also want a buffer for the sky, but as you can see in our scene, we don't have a sky object. That's actually going to be derived from creating buffers for everything, and then we just invert that, and that's going to give us the buffer for the sky. So this will just kind of add up as we go along. So to do this, we need to create a buffer for this entire section, and the instances will just inherit the buffer information automatically, so we just need to apply it here, and this is going to be buffer number 3. That's almost everything except for the hill that's in the distance. We can copy this over to that. The next step is to go back to our render settings, and let's add 3 object buffers. So we hit multipass, buffer number 1, 2, and 3. If I select all 3 at once by holding Shift, selecting the first one, hold Shift and go to the lowest one, we can have 1, 2, and 3 in here. These IDs need to correspond to what we set up in the tags. So now we can render again. It's going to tell us to overwrite what we previously rendered. That's fine. We are still in this layer section looking at single passes, and we can go through the different layers. This time we have an additional 3 buffers. So the first one is the character, the second one is the telephone poles, and the third one should contain everything including the telephone poles, but you can see they're clearly missing, and also the character is being excluded from this particular buffer. So let's see why that's happening. The character is outside of that buffer. We just didn't add it, but the telephone poles are in that main section. So the thing is, if you have object buffers which are children of an object buffer up here, it will be excluded from the top one unless you explicitly. So that's why the poles were subtracted from this buffer. So we have to go to this tag and also make sure that 3 is enabled. The hierarchy in Cinema 4D calculates from the top down, so anything that's lower will overwrite anything that's higher. I hope that makes sense, but anyway, just to make sure you do the same as I've just done. And in the character, this character is also going to be in buffer number 3. And now if I do that again, this should be the final setup. So we have object buffer number 1, that's the character. number 2 is the telephone poles, and 3 contains everything that's in the scene. So we can now use this black and white mask in After Effects, which of course in After Effects they're called track mats, so a different name, but it refers to the same thing. We will simply just invert this in order to select the sky instead of everything else in our scene. So if you had other buffers you wanted to set up for other objects, you would just continue using the tags like this and continuing down on this list, and then just make sure that in your output you have the corresponding object buffers and numbers set up correctly. Anyway, that would be it. To output everything, you would render to picture viewer like we've been doing up to this point, but I find it's much better to use the render queue. So let's go to render, add to render queue. I can get rid of any old projects I have there. Here I would just hit start rendering, and if you had multiple projects you can line all of them up and perhaps go and do something else in the meantime. After this renders a couple of frames, it will use the render time to calculate or to estimate a total render time, and for me that's going to be anywhere in the region of 8 hours. So this is the kind of render I would do overnight, or if maybe I was going somewhere for the day, I would leave this processing, and then when I either wake up or come back, the render would be finished. So this is the folder where the images are going into. We can see the main image sequence. Let's go back up a level and go to our multipass folder. You can see all the multipass frames will go into a single folder. So this is the fog, for example. We have the different masks, the shadows, and so on, and this will just fill up with all your frames. So make sure this is going to a location with plenty of space, because rendering 16-bit images and so many of them will add up over time, and you will need the space. If you run out of space whilst rendering, this is just going to stop and give you an error. Anyway, that's it. So at this point, whilst our images are rendering, it's a good time to take a break, and when we come back we can start in After Effects. We are now going to import our images into After Effects, and we want to check that the color management is correct and that also the frames are playing at the correct frames per second. To import our footage into After Effects, we need to double click anywhere in the import window, or the project window rather, and that's going to open up the import dialog. And we are going to start by bringing in the main sequence, which if I just select any of the frames, I can tick PNG sequence, and it will automatically fetch the entire frame range from 0 to nearly 57 seconds. And then we have the object buffers, and then we have the multipass layers and masks. So let's go to that folder. Now there's so much in here that it's gonna be quite a bit tedious to grab all of these at once. So I recommend using the list view and then just finding the relevant sequences and then just bringing them in one by one. Sometimes you can actually just select any of these, press Ctrl and A, which of course creates a multiple selection. And if you were to do that, this PNG sequence button would turn into a different button saying multiple sequences. And After Effects is capable of importing all of these at once, but I find that with so many frames like I have now, and it's these 16-bit PNG files, I would risk the computer crashing if I tried to import everything at once. So unfortunately, I will just have to do this one by one. Fortunately though, it's not too difficult because you can still just scroll through and pick out the relevant sequences that we are after. And from each one, you are just looking for one frame and then just picking the correct number. So I already have object buffer 1, 2, we have 3. This is an earlier version of the project where I had 4 object buffers. So let's get that one as well. And I already have my Atmos layer. Those are actually the only ones I will need for now. We also did output like the shadows, specular, and reflections, but we'll just leave those for now. In After Effects, this will probably be at 30 FPS for you, unless you've changed the default setting. It's just over here. But I can right-click this, go to Interpret Footage, Main, and we can set that to be 24 FPS as well. And then I can right-click this, Interpret Footage, and remember the interpretation. And then if any of these other sequences were the wrong FPS, I can right-click all of them at once, Interpret Footage, and apply the interpretation. And then everything would be the same FPS. And that's very important here. Everything needs to match up. Anyway, let's take the main sequence and bring it into a new composition, which gives us this. Now at this point, I just want to make sure that my color management is working correctly. By default, my settings use my displays color management. So this looks exactly as it did in Cinema 4D. The colors have stayed consistent. But let's say I were to turn off this, it's using this sRGB color profile, which is the same color profile as my screen. We can see what others could look like, possibly. For example, Adobe RGB. If I switch to that and click OK, you will see the image looks different. It looks more washed out now. And I would have to apply some color correction effects to get this to look like it did in Cinema 4D. So obviously, that's not the best approach. What I recommend is to use your screen profile, whatever that is, so that your colors stay the same between Cinema 4D and After Effects. Anyway, I would click OK for this, and we are now back to where we were before. And just one other thing, the bit depth should be 16 bits per channel, and that's fine. But once we have all of these sequences in After Effects, we can start to do the compositing. So that's our fog layer. We are going to be using that a few times. We have the object buffers, which are going to be also very useful. And we can just double check everything is working as expected. In this lesson, we're going to do the first 2 examples of our project just by changing the background. And this will be done using those masks and layers that we brought in from Cinema 4D. We will start with these 2 versions, and then we will go to a different lesson for this final example because it involves some different techniques. This all looks very messy right now because it was my experimental version of this project. So let's go back to the version where we had just imported our sequences. And to keep things organized, I am going to take all of these frames and put them into a new folder. Let's just call these renders. We had already dragged our main composition or our main sequence into a new composition, but we can repeat that step once again just to see how that's done. And a quick scrub through this, we see, so there is actually some flickering in this render, which I noticed after the full render finished. I can just see it on the floor. So it may have been worth it to actually render in Cinema 4D with those slightly higher render settings in the anti-aliasing section in particular. That would have smoothed out this flickering we see. So that's worth mentioning here again, but I will also have inserted a note in that lesson when we were going over the render settings. But anyway, this does not affect what we are about to do. So let's just continue. I am going to double click in the project window to bring up my import. And here I have several images that we can use as backgrounds. let's start with the moon. I will import that, and let's place this into this composition just above our main sequence. This is a huge image, so we want to scale it down. I think somewhere around 18 to 20% should be fine. We have these object buffers, and the one we want right now is object buffer number 4, or whatever number of buffer where everything is contained in the mask. So this version for me, I will put this above my moon, and on the moon layer, let's go to the track matte menu, and if this is not visible, you want to press F4 to bring up that menu. And let's go to this button and go to Luma Matte Inverted and point to the layer above. And it's the inverted version because we want our moon to show up where it's black instead. Normally you might use masks the other way in Luma Matte to have pixels show up where the mask is white, but we want to do the opposite this time. And now our moon is behind everything in our scene. Now we need to continue making some changes. If I press P on the moon layer to bring up the position, I am going to move this up just a bit higher in the frame. If I enable the title and action safe, I usually like to keep my objects inside the title safe as well, so somewhere about there. Let's go ahead and bring in another image. This time it's this star field, which if I double click to preview, it's just this. So this is going to be behind our moon. So if we also place this above the main sequence, and let's use the same object buffer to only have the stars where the sky is. So if we place the buffer above the sky or the stars layer, we can use the same track matte mode. So Luma Inverted. So once again, that blends behind there. If I go to the layer itself, I will go to color correction and levels. Let's increase the black point to make more contrast. We need it to be as dark as possible. We just want to see the stars, and that's it. Also, the whole layer is too big. So if I zoom out here and press S to bring up the scale, we can lower this down to closer to the size of our actual frame. Now we no longer have any blending between our render and the background. Instead, we have these really hard edges. So to fix this, I'm going to get the fog, which will go on top of everything. Let's screen this layer. And again, I will get object buffer number 4 and use the same track matte mode. So we now have something like this. Let's go to the moon and do some color correction. Starting with a tint effect, we will map the white to a hue of about 25 and maybe saturation of about 30-35%, just to warm up the tones instead. Let's get a curves adjustment. This time we are going to increase the contrast, so something like this. We can maybe pull down the shadows just a touch. Let's get an adjustment layer, and I will go to Effect, Stylize and Glow. You can see the moon is the brightest part of the image. We can adjust the strength of the glow using the threshold. So if I set this all the way to 100% and the radius to 100, we have this kind of red glow effect. I don't really like this too much, so I would change the tones by setting these two colors here, color A and color B. Let's just start by picking a color from the moon surface to get the right type of tone, and do the same for B. and then maybe just increase the saturation slightly on both of these. And then we need to change the glow colors from original to A and B. And when we do that, we also need to just adjust the threshold down. Not too much. I want this to be quite a subtle effect. We can go back to the moon layer itself and maybe just lower the intensity just down a touch. And I think about there it's fine. Let's get another adjustment layer for more color stuff. This time we are going to use the Lumetri color effect, which is found under color correction and then Lumetri color. In the basic correction, I will start by increasing the temperature to about 25. That's going to warm up the image even further. And we can play with other things here, such as the exposure, maybe about 0.25, just to brighten everything a touch. Nothing too extreme. In the creative section, let's maybe put more vibrance, so about 25 as well, and 125 for saturation, just to really make this really punchy. If we continue further down, we have a curves section, which I can use to play with the colors. So let's say the green, we can lower this down just to take out some of those green tones. And we need to adjust the other way. So in the RGB, which is all three channels at once, I will start by creating an offset just to fade the shadows, and then maybe just play with a bit of contrast, not too much. To see a bit more of this detail in the shadows, we can adjust down here by adding another handle there. And you can see if I really push this up, it brightens the dark parts of the image. And that's because we rendered in that 16-bit format. So this holds a lot of information for making adjustments like these. So I would say about here is fine. Perhaps my moon is just too saturated and a bit too red. So we can adjust both of those things and just try to get a balance. So the glow might be too strong now. We can adjust that too, but you get the idea. If I pre-compose the atmosphere layer first by right-clicking and pre-compose, let's call this fog 01. And we just need to adjust the blending mode to screen once again. And now this will act as if it's just a single layer. And I can duplicate that. It's just a bit easier. So this is just one example of what you could do with this render from Cinema 4D. Let's go back to this version, just the original, and try something that's a bit different, but similar still. For this one, we'll bring in a new background image. This is from pxhere.com, which is a site with free images which you can download and use in your own projects, and these are all royalty free. So this example, in our main composition, we will drag this in and give it the same treatment with the buffers. So track matte inverted, we can see it's too high and it's also too large, so let's scale it down first. And if I press P for their position, we can bring it down, and we just need to make it larger. I think I will go for about 60 and continue to position it correctly just until where these mountains start to appear. Just put that below our actual scene. So we need some color adjustment on this. It's too faded. Let's apply a levels adjustment with color correction and bring in the input black, just to create more contrast. It helps with seeing our telephone poles and wires closer up here. I would say about there. And I really like the style and color of this particular background. However, it's a bit empty still, so we want to combine that with our stars. If we go back to the project tab, let's get the stars once again and the buffer once again. Exactly the same setup. Let's scale these down to just a bit larger than our frame. And the blending mode is going to be screen. So we combine it with the sky image. And another levels adjustment, you could do this with curves as well, but I prefer levels in this case. So I am left with only the stars. And I would say that's it there. This one is much simpler. We can get another adjustment layer. This will be for the... We can get another adjustment layer. This will be for another lumetri color. And I'm going to warm up the image just a bit, again about 25. It gives me some nicer tones in the background. We could even try tinting and see what that does. If we set the tint higher, that brings in some more cooler kind of purple tones. So maybe let's do that just a bit, maybe about 10. And then from here we just do whatever to try and get a nice looking frame. The shadows control here can also bring out more detail. The shadows control here can also bring more detail into the really dark areas. So maybe that's better than using the curves tool. Let's set that to about 40. Further down, I think green can come out again. Just let's drop this down. And I will create another slightly faded shadow look, just like we did before. We have a lot of control with this lumetri color section just because there's so many handles and tools built into this single effect. Let's go further down to hue versus hue. This will adjust some particular tones. Let's say the warmer tones, which are over here somewhere. If I pick a couple of points, this kind of continues over to the other side. So if we move this, the line moves over here too. And we can just see what we can do. So this can be used to change tones and so on. We could maybe affect the blue colors. Let's go for that orange and teal color correction, and we end up with something like this. I would say that's okay for this one. It's quite simple compared to the other two examples. Let's bring in the fog once again though, and also buffer that. So just to put on top of everything that might just help with the blending. It's entirely optional at this point. So that's it for this lesson, and hopefully now we can really see the advantages of this type of workflow. Because we have those layers and masks from Cinema 4D, we can quickly change what the visual looks like in After Effects without having to go back and re-render anything. So we will continue with this idea in the next lesson and do the main example of the galaxy. This is the main example from the project, the spinning galaxy in the distance. We are going to use similar techniques from the previous lesson, but also some new techniques such as extracting 3D data from our Cinema 4D scene to use as reference of where the galaxy should be placed. Once again, starting with our main sequence, let's bring that to a new composition. And the background for this is this image right here. So a lot more color in it than the previous image we used for the stars, but you can essentially use whatever you want. Let's bring that in as a layer and press S for the scale and bring it down to roughly the size of the frame. And of course, this needs to be behind the sky only. So if we get our buffer once again and invert the luma, let's bring in the galaxy next. That's this image. and we will just drop this in. So this is a flat image, but clearly in this example, it's a 3D layer which is rotating out there in the distance. We could just try and estimate, the rough rotation it should be, how far it should be out there and so on. But we can actually get the correct 3D data by using the information from our Cinema 4D file. So if we go back to the project in Cinema 4D, we want the 3D data from the camera, and we are also going to place an object in the distance to use as a placeholder of where the galaxy is going to be in After Effects. I'm gonna save this file first as 3D data. I can overwrite the previous version I used to test this idea. And what I would do is just strip away all of these objects, because we just need the camera really. That's about it. I can look out of the camera, and let's create a new null object, which I will call the galaxy. This is going to be our placeholder. Now, this object is going to be placed really far out in the distance. So basically anywhere past where these hills are. Let's say about here, and also higher. So if we were looking through our camera, we can estimate where the center of the galaxy is going to be. If we compare to the final version, it's about maybe a quarter of the way down. So roughly about here. We can always adjust this later anyway. So in After Effects, things like cameras and lights will be automatically picked up in the or included in the 3D data when we extract it. But for normal objects like this to show up, we have to attach what's called an external compositing tag. This is found under render tags and then external compositing. So we just need to add it and then nothing else. So we save this particular file and go back to After Effects. And in here we can just import our Cinema 4D file. I am dragging this from a second monitor. And this is one of my favorite features in After Effects, the fact that Cinema 4D files can be opened directly like this. We can drag this to a new composition button, just like as if it were a layer, and we can quickly see a wireframe preview of the scene from Cinema 4D. We don't really need to do anything with this except for hit this extract scene data, and this will be in the Effects Controls tab. Let's extract. And when I do that, we have the objects from Cinema 4D. So the main thing here is our camera and this galaxy object that we are going to use as a placeholder. So if I select that and just scrub through with my camera, you can see that it's moving. Now it's moving right now, but it's not supposed to be. That's because we need to make it a child of the camera. So it moves with the camera now, which will make it look like it stays in the same place. So anyway, once that link is created, we can take that object and the camera, go back to our composition, press Shift V to paste. And if we turn our galaxy layer into a 3D layer, let's press F4 to toggle the 3D menu, this button right here. The galaxy has now disappeared out of view, so we need to make it a child of the galaxy placeholder. And if I press P to bring up the position of the layer itself, we can zero out these values. So now it's out there somewhere in the distance. We can press S to bring up the scale, and from some tests I did, you need to put something like 10,000 before you can even see it. And if I press R for the rotation, I can tilt it back so it's at a flat angle. I used 310 in the original. Next up, of course, we need to place this behind our scene, which means using the buffer one more time. Press F4 and use Luma inverted. This doesn't look very great right now with these hard edges, so we need to pre-compose this layer. Right click and pre-compose. Leave all the attributes in this layer, so tick this over here, and this composition is going to be called Galaxy Precomposed number 1. So if we click OK, nothing changes, but because it's pre-composed, we can now jump into this layer and make some changes, which will automatically update in the other composition. So in here, we just want to feather the edges of this frame. And because it's square, I can just go to the masks and select ellipse tool. And if I just double click, it will automatically create a mask which goes edge to edge. Now I can press F for the feathering, and we're going to use 200. You could use less or more depending on your image. This would still have some hard edges, so we have to bring this radius in, which is going to be found under expansion. And generally I find that whatever you feather, if you set the expansion to be half that, but like the negative half that, so this time negative 100, that's going to bring in the borders far enough and also soften the transition. Let's go back to the main comp, and you can see that's already looking better. And to complete the blending effect, let's change this layer's blending mode from normal to screen. So of course, all of that 3D setup we did is so that we can rotate and animate this galaxy. So if I click on that layer and hit R for the rotation controls, we want to change the Z rotation. So at frame 0, let's set a keyframe. Let's go all the way to the end. And this needs to be a full revolution or a full rotation so that we have a continuous loop, just like the base animation. So this is just going to be 360. And now if I were to scrub through, we can just quickly preview the first frame and the last frame, and we can see they are the same. So this would be looping if we previewed the whole animation. It's going the wrong way around. So we are going to set this to negative 360. I just deleted that keyframe and then reinserted it. And the direction this is spinning depends, of course, on the direction of the spirals on the galaxy. So if your image was going the other way, you would adjust that accordingly. Anyway, this is all at half quality. Let's drop down to a quarter, which is really low, but for preview purposes, it should be fine. I'm going to press N at 10 seconds just to temporarily limit the timeline range to just that small section. And if I press the spacebar to do a quick preview, let's see how that looks. I just want to get a sense of the general motion that we have so far. So just as a preview, I generally like what I'm looking at, but it's too fast. If we compare that to the final version, you can see I slowed down the rotation by half. Now, we can't just limit the rotation to go from 0 to 180, which would slow it down, because that would no longer loop. We still need to go from 0 to 360. So what we have to do instead is extend our composition length to be double, and that should accommodate the extra time needed to go twice as slow for this rotation. Now this means that all of our rendered sequences so far will have to be double in length. So the setup for this is going to be as follows. Let's start by just keeping our comp length to the maximum. And then if I go to comp settings, and I'm not sure here what the double length would be, so I'll just go for 2 minutes. That's at least twice as long. And if I click OK, we can extend the timeline range. And right now our layers, they all end at the original length, which is half what we want. So if we start with the main render layer, for example, we can go to Interpret Footage and Main. And all the way down here, there is a loop control, which I will set from 1 to 2. And if I click OK, we will immediately see the new range of this particular layer. So it will play to the initial point, and then because we set the loop to 2, it will now extend in the timeline. So we just fill this out and make sure it reaches the end. We can then remember the interpretation, and let's apply this to any layers which are included in our project. So all of the object buffers, let's apply that, and anything that's in this composition, we extend to the same point once again. Also, if I now click on this comp on its own, for example, I can see what the actual new length is supposed to be. I don't know how eligible this is on Skillshare, but that's 1 minute, 54 seconds, and 20 frames. So in comp settings, let's do the same. It's going to be 1, 54, and 10. Click OK. The background image, this can just stretch anyway, it's just a single layer. And in this composition of our galaxy, let's do the same. And since it's just, an image layer, we can just go for, anything, basically add a 2 minutes and stretch it out. We just need that comp to fit in this composition. And of course, in the original runtime, everything is fine except past this point, our galaxy disappears. It's up here somewhere. That's because the camera's 3D data still ends at this point. So we have to go back to Cinema 4D and adjust our project to match the length in After Effects. So 1, 54, and 20. And in the timeline window, our current animation still ends like, halfway. So if we were to grab that frame, let's adjust the time to go to that new endpoint. And also it's like it's traveling twice as long now because it's just going to be continuing. So we just double the keyframe value from 7,500 to 15,000. So it's as if, after the midpoint, it just continued. We don't really see the effects of this all that much, except just a few lines moving across the screen. But if I were to save this and go back to After Effects, and let's just bring this to a new composition once again, we can see it's the correct new length, double. We can extract the data once again, and that's these two items, the camera and the galaxy. Let's make the galaxy a child of the camera and copy these, go back to our main composition, and let's do all of this at frame 0. We can delete the original, paste this in, and let's just make sure our galaxy is also a child of its parent null up here. And if I press P for their position just to double check, I can see everything is in the correct spot. So with those adjustments, we have now doubled the length of our animation, which allows us to slow down the rotation rate of the galaxy. So now if we go to the galaxy and select the end keyframe, we can move this all the way to the end of the animation. So by doubling the duration, this is now going to be rotating at half its original speed, and I just preferred that kind of motion for this particular animation. Now you could, of course, choose something that spins faster or slower. And now if I do another preview, I can see I much prefer this version, which just moves at a slower rate. We can move on to the other effects in the scene, and I will start with this orange haze. This is actually just a new solid layer, and let's call it haze. We will once again use our buffer, which is getting a lot of mileage today. Let's put this below the galaxy, or maybe above actually, since it may just kind of cover that up and help with the general blending. Let's get the pen tool up here and draw, just following the border between the mountains and the sky. Let's press F to bring up the feathering for that mask, and I will set this to 250 just to fade that effect in. And then we can maybe go to the expansion, and let's say about 50, just to expand its reach and make it stronger. So I think about there is fine. We could perhaps play with a couple of these blending modes. Let's say add or screen. That's going to have a different effect, but I quite like just how vivid the normal blending mode is. We get all of that orange color coming through. Alternatively, you could have used an image of the sky, which already has that haze sort of built into it. Kind of like the previous sky example from the last lesson. But anyway, we have the option to do whatever, including just building a completely new layer for that. The next major effect are these light rays that we see coming off of the galaxy. In order to do this one, we will start by precomposing the galaxy and its object buffer. So if I right click, let's precompose this, and let's call it galaxy. Before we apply the light rays, we have to precompose our galaxy layer and its object buffer. And of course, the galaxy is 3D, so we have to precompose these other two objects with it so that the animation is maintained. This will be galaxy precomposed number 2. We just have to once again change the blending mode to screen. Let's extend this timeline duration to contain our entire animation. And with our galaxy layer, let's maybe place this underneath our haze. I will make a copy of this. And on this layer, let's isolate it by itself using this switch. And then I'm going to go to Effect, and using trap code Shine, we can generate the light rays. Now, this is of course a third-party plugin, so I'm aware that some people may not have this. So in a minute or two, I will show you how to do a similar effect with some built-in After Effects tools. So let's go to Shine. And one thing I want to change right away is the source to be lower down here so the rays point more upward. We don't want to change the colors too much because I quite like what we have. I will perhaps just change the highlights to be an orange color as well. Let's maybe make them more orange. Both of these, set them to 35, and this one that's a bit red can be about 7 or so. And the ray length I will drop down to 2, and let's say the boost light, we can try and see what that does. Maybe about 2 also. Let's bring back all the other layers, and I want to change the blend mode of this layer from screen inside this effect to none, which by the way, if I show you what it's like now, before in screen mode, it was overlaying this effect on the original pixels and then overlaying this entire layer. on top of our other galaxy. So it ends up blowing out all of the colors and we lose any saturation and such. So let's go to none, which means it's just the light rays. So I just prefer this look. Let's maybe bump up the boost light to 4. And what's great about this effect is it's dynamic, which means as the pixels move around, we get this really nice shimmering effect. Now, one of the issues is the light rays are cutting through our telephone poles. Now, if this was really out there in the distance, you wouldn't see this kind of effect closer to the camera. So once again, if we get a buffer for this layer, we can pre-compose another time. And now you see the light rays are correctly rendered behind the objects in the foreground. So that's it for this effect using trapcode Shine. But if you don't have this particular plugin, we can try something similar using a built-in After Effects tool. So if I were to temporarily, let's say, make a copy of this, so Control and D, let's turn off the top one. This is just for backup because I don't want to completely get rid of it. But on the one that remains, we can solo this by itself as well. Let's go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and I will get the fast radial blur. And you can see it gives us a similar kind of light ray effect. Let's move this point down, the origin, so the rays point up once again. And we can also change the zoom control from standard to, let's say, brightest. And what this does is change where the light rays are coming from. And the amount, of course, controls the length of the rays. About 85 in this case works best. If I unsolo this so we can see it on top of the original image, if I do a quick preview, we can see these light rays are flickering, and I don't really like that too much. That's why I prefer the trapcode Shine effect. It's a bit smoother than this one. If we go back to this layer and let's say apply a fast box blur, let's put this before the radial blur and then set the radius to about 2. You can see it ends up trimming away some of those super sharp light rays, which should help to reduce the amount of flickering. And that's exactly what happens. And the other thing here is the color. Now, this is just using the colors from the original image, which can look quite nice. But let's say you want to have a different tone. The other thing, of course, are the colors. Right now, this is using the colors from the original image, which can look quite nice, actually. But let's say you want your own color for this. Then you would just go to color correction and let's say a tint and map the white to whatever color you want. So let's say, so that's it. And we can play with things like the strength of the radial blur, the amount. If I go to 100, you can see it's very different. And that's because this value is very sensitive. So use it sparingly. And if we want the whole thing to be stronger, we can try different blending modes. So add will make the core much brighter. I actually prefer this version. We could also just copy these two layers, the layer and its buffer, and that makes the effect twice as strong. To finish off, we're going to do the final color adjustments, and these will be broadly similar to what we have been doing so far. So using the Lumetri color effect, one of my favorite effects in this program, let's try warming it up and see how that looks. I definitely prefer those tones. Of course, it depends on the image. I like to complement what's already there and just making it more vivid and stronger. The general exposure of the scene can be bumped up to, let's say, by 1. Let's show more detail in the shadows, so maybe about 20. Not too much, because we still want some contrast in the scene. We can of course do that with the curves, and the render here seemingly has a lot of green, so I will always pull this down just a touch. If your scene is different, you may not have to do this, but for this version I definitely prefer these kind of blue and red shadows. And with this curve I would just create more contrast, the classic S-curve for creating contrast. And finally, once again, maybe just bring in a bit of that detail in the shadows again. In the blue channel, I will put a point in the middle here, and I want to just create some more yellow in the highlights. As I pull this down, you can see the brightest parts of the image are just warming up a bit. But the shadows and mid colors I will leave largely the same. So a quick comparison between before and after. Let's go back up here, and in the creative section we can add some vibrance, maybe 25 or maybe higher. At some point it starts to look too extreme. I think 40 is okay. And this is already so colorful, I don't think adding too much saturation will help here. But I would stop there. This is one of those things you could keep tinkering with. So I'm just gonna stop here. Before the final render, we could do a reduced preview at half, third, or quarter quality, just to double check that everything is fine. But I'm not gonna do that, because just quickly scrubbing through, and the fact that I've done this project a couple of times already, I can see everything is fine anyway. But let's say you really want to double check, we can go to Edit, Purge, and All Memory and Disk Cache. And this is going to free up the RAM and any local cache files which may have built up as we were working on this. And then now you can do the preview. If you just press the spacebar, this will take a while, so that's one of the reasons I avoided. And anyway, when this is finished, you can preview your whole animation before you do the final output. Anyway, let's continue. The actual output, we go to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and the best format in my opinion is QuickTime, and in the format options we choose Animation. This is going to give us a very large file which will still contain enough information for further color adjustments in applications like Premiere Pro, for things like adding music and then posting to YouTube or Instagram. Anyway, once we choose that format, we can then save this anywhere or in our folder location, our project location rather. Let's save that, and then we can just hit render. And here is a quick tip. After a few seconds, I can see how long this is going to take. It's saying about 44 minutes. So I would definitely step away from the computer and just let this run through. If I press caps lock, that's going to disable this preview from refreshing. And this is going to improve your render time. So you should do the same, because there's really no need not to. It will be a faster render. And for the final export for both Instagram and YouTube, I use Premiere Pro to do my final edits. This is where I add music and any further color adjustments I want to make. So for example, if I double click to import, we can bring in our 3 different sequences here. Let's right click one of these and new sequence from clip. And now we can edit on this timeline. And this is a loop, of course. So if I were to copy that first one and line it up next to the second one and play, you see it loops seamlessly. So I would maybe add some music, that type of thing, and any other adjustments I want to make in Premiere Pro. Because also actually the lumetri color effect is present in Premiere Pro. So it's in this tab and it opens up over here, and you can continue to make further adjustments if you wish to. And because of the format we rendered from After Effects, that QuickTime animation, there is enough information to change the image without destroying the colors. Here is a quick edit I came up with using the song that my friend actually composed specifically for this Skillshare class. That's the song you've been hearing in the introduction sections of all the lessons. You can listen to the full song on Spotify. It's called Focus by P.T. Nelson, and I'll put a quick tag on the screen for that. Anyway, this is just a quick edit as an example. So it's not a completely smooth playback because the files are so massive and I'm not playing them back off an SSD or anything like that. It's just a regular external drive. If this is an issue for your project as well, you can look into something called proxies, which can help to speed up your editing speed. And there's plenty of tutorials about that on YouTube, so I won't go into it here, but I just thought I would mention it. Anyway, for the actual final export, I would go to File, Export, and Media. And my final format is always H.264. And the preset I use is the YouTube 2160p 4K. I always upscale my renders to 4K even if they are originally 1080, like this one. Because when you post a 4K clip to YouTube, it seems to play back at a better quality than just posting it at native 1080p. And I do the same thing for Instagram. I will take this height, and if this is not linked together, I can change the width to be the same for a square frame, and then I would go to the source scaling and change this to scale to fill. And this is 2160 by 2160, which is double what Instagram's maximum resolution is, 1080 by 1080. But once again, upscaling seems to just generally help with the quality on Instagram as well. So when everything's ready, I can go to the output name, click on this and save to a particular location, hit save, and I can export this directly in this window, or we can queue this up, which is going to launch Adobe Media Encoder, which is actually my preferred method for exporting these visuals. We can see a couple of old projects. Let's delete those. I use Encoder because I can line up more than one render at a time, and then when I'm ready to output everything, I just click play and the output will process. So anyway, that's it. That's my final export process for my visuals, starting in After Effects and then doing the final edits in Premiere Pro. So that's it. That is the end of the project. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys learned some new things. So of course, I want you guys to take what you've learned and apply it to your own projects. And of course, feel free to share it with the class below, and I'll be able to give you some feedback as well. If you do get stuck on any part of the lessons, you can of course use the discussions section below to ask for help, and just make sure you attach a screenshot. It makes it easier for me to work out what's going on. Anyway, that's it from me, and once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.